Hi, everyone. My name is Melis Karaca. I'm your moderator. Thank you so much for joining us today, taking the time for this session. And before we start, I would like to inform you that this is a recorded session. Hope you don't mind. As you know, today we will be discussing the cultural revolution among Generation Z. And as you already know and aware of it, we are in the midst of polycrisis. I mean, think about global warming, the war between Russia and Ukraine, and we just had a global pandemic that affected millions of lives. But what is really happening beneath the surface of all this turmoil? What are the undercurrents in the global population? So Martijn and Mash will be sharing these insights, along with marketing implications. And please use the chat box to raise your questions. You don't need to wait until the end of the session. You can shoot them in anytime. And once they're done with their presentation, they're going to answer your questions. All right, so let's start. I'll leave the stage to Martijn.
So welcome also on behalf of Glocalities. I'm a co-founder and research director of Glocalities. I'll be telling you much more about the trends. So let's hand over to Mash.
Yes, I'm Mash Muravina. I'm an insights consultant in Glocalities, and I specialize in inclusivity research for corporations and NGOs, but I'm also helping FMCG brands with growth strategies. So I'm going to be helping with what does that mean for your company in broader terms. Of course, it wouldn't differ case per case, but in general terms.
Thanks, Mash. So now I'm sharing my screen about the webinar. And this is a briefing on the study that we released in end of November last year. And it got a lot of attention and it went viral on LinkedIn. So it really hits a nerve. And I'm glad to see you all here so we can share and talk about all these findings. As a background, here we find the highlights. I would like to start by saying that half of the world population is under 30. We often forget that here in Europe with aging societies. And still in Europe also, the young generation is very important because we are an aging society. And we also need to take into account that 9 out of 10 young people globally of Generation Z are coming from emerging economies, developing economies. So if you really want to think about the future and where the world is heading, it is of vital importance to zoom in on their values. And we did that based on a massive study conducted in 20 countries with 7 waves of fieldwork since 2014. And we were just looking at trends. What trends do we discover? Because we do our research amongst the age range of 18 to 70 years old. But what really occurred is that there is a shift and that this young generation, Gen Z, now 18 to 24 years old, is increasingly becoming different than young people of 8 years ago, but also than the older generations. And it's a gradual, a slow shift, a slow development, but a very strong one. So here in a nutshell, you will see the findings that much more in detail, Masha and I will explain later on. But we use the metaphor of a butterfly trying to break free. And that's a process of development, and that's a process that can also hurt. But this is what we saw as a metaphor in the daytime, because increasingly young people feel anxieties, pessimistic. They have concerns about the climate, about human rights violations, but at the same time, other trends are emerging that may be more beneficial. And these trends are diverging in, on the one hand, emerging economies where they are striving for equality and emancipation, and in the advanced economies Well, we already had the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and the 70s. That's still going on, but now there's a search for spirituality, quality of life, and meaning. And this has lots of implications throughout. And at Glocalities, we always look at developing potential of people, of organizations, of cultures, of communities, countries. And this is a metaphor that shows that first you have to look inward and look at what's hidden, and the roots grow very deep into the ground before trends come to the surface. And then at the surface, trends are going, with the seasons, So this is why we combine in our research, looking at what drives people, what's hidden below the surface, with what is happening, well, outside. Here are some technical details. We have 7 waves of fieldwork in place. You can read all about this in the report that you probably already downloaded at our website, and I would recommend to do so. So glocalities.com/trends 2022. And in each fieldwork wave, we have around 50,000 people interviewed in those 20 countries. The whole Glocalities program, it covers already 55 countries, but these are the countries from the start where we have data since 2014. And as I said, we look at what's going on below the surface. So we have instruments measuring cultures, archetypes, emotions, aspirations, value segments. And we combine that with questions on who people are, what their ideals are, what their lifestyles are, what their behaviors are. Now, let's delve into the Cultural Revolution amongst Gen Z, because there are some profound shifts. These are the 6 value strands that we will be covering in this webinar. Rising anxieties, open minds on the rise, traditional values fading, instant gratification, hedonism on the rise, attention to brands and authenticity, and looking for meaning, spirituality, art, and vitality. All these trends are going on. Of course, in some countries more than in others, in some audiences more than others, but this is happening throughout. So these rising anxieties, and we all know the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, but also earlier, the climate crisis took hold and is one of the main worries of the young generation. And here I show you how we measure this. So here we have, for example, a statement from our research. I feel let down by society. And the young generation increasingly feels let down. And society is not fulfilling them or facilitating the fulfillment of their potential. So in red, and you see Gen Z, now 18 to 24 years old. In orange, you see the group that's slightly older, mostly also millennials, and then you see the oldest generation in blue, 55 to 70 years old. That's the oldest age cohort, and there you see that on this trend, they are much more stable. So if you look worldwide, it's a slight increase, but if you then break it down, the young generation is increasingly let down. And also in advanced economies. I sometimes feel that the future holds nothing for me. That's an effect. They are increasingly depressed. We also see that, of course, from literature studies and research from the WHO on the mental health crisis. And again, 18 to 24 years old score highest. And this is happening in both advanced and upcoming economies. So let's go to the next slide, because this is about their concerns. And they are very much concerned about human rights in many ways. Sexual harassment and abuse is on the top of their list of concerns. Human rights violations overall, child abuse and neglect, climate change, extreme poverty. This is also the world that this young generation is growing up in. And so many of these topics are indeed also depressing. There's reason to be anxious. So let's face this. These are some of the main results. So much maybe you can delve a bit into the implications of these results. Actually, in the meantime, I would like to stress that Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, also reacted to our study. He is now investigating the human rights violations in Iran with his team. He said, this report is of great relevance as it shows that human rights issues are a major concern for the younger generation, and that young people are increasingly interested in engaging in politics. Young people demand a better future. They need to be empowered and realize their full potential. That is what this report points towards. And we realized it, we released it together with the international advocacy organization Global Citizen. Marsh, would you like to tell us a bit about the implications?
Yeah, so what does that mean? So Gen Z are incredibly struggling from anxieties, whether it comes to gender discrimination, Me Too, climate crisis. They are very much the most aware of how bad things are. And it is important to acknowledge it. And also, what is your role? What role do you play as an agency? So, if you are a brand, and of course, it really differs depending on what kind of company you are, what kind of markets you're working with, but it is important to tap into their worries, empathize with Gen Z, and become their ally. Provide whatever kind of source you can help with alleviating those kinds of causes. If you are an NGO, to show them in which ways can they personally combat those, that they can volunteer, that they can donate for these types of causes, because right now there's a lot of helplessness and hopelessness from the Gen Z. So it is about a lot about empowering them and showing that there are opportunities for solution and expanding a little bit their future horizon, because they're thinking a lot about in terms of immediate time frame, and then no clarity on how their future looks like at all. Incredibly high pessimism.
Yeah. So this is the point of departure. At the same time, we also see trends that you could consider more hopeful because it's opening new horizons, but departing from a context of extreme stress. So we see that young people increasingly are becoming open-minded. They are the highest educated generation ever in human history. They are exposed, of course, through the internet to many visions and ideologies and ways of looking at the world. So here we see one of the other values statements from our research. I'm always open to people with another religion or philosophy of life. And this is where the generations start dividing, because it's rather stable or slightly increasing amongst the older cohorts. But among Gen Z, it's the highest overall. And it's increasingly being the case. And in upcoming economies even, that are generally much more conservative and patriarchal, this is where these changes are taking place even more so. Another topic that we have also been researching with the late Professor Ronald Inglehart, the founder of the World Values Survey. He sadly passed away last year, but we already saw some of these changes in some projects with him. And he is the author of the book, The Silent Revolution. And in the 60s and the 70s, he discovered the silent revolution that was going on in the West with the student protests in Paris and in Amsterdam and in many Western countries. Now, we see these trends happening throughout the world and also in upcoming economies. So it's also a bit in honor of his work that we are presenting these results to continue that work. Here, general flexibility. I think it's perfectly all right when men show their feminine side. Again, the youngest cohort, now Gen Z, is scoring highest overall. And people in upcoming economies are catching up. And this is something that generally scores higher in advanced economies. And here you see the mean score on a 5-point Likert scale. And that starts with strongly disagree, disagree, neutral, agree, totally agree. And then you see these averages going up. And in advanced economies, it was already high overall, because there's upcoming economies are generally more conservative. But steeply, upcoming economies, where 9 out of 10 young people live, are catching up.
So what does that mean for you? It's a big one because no matter if you're taking any media space, any kind of marketing or voice or any eyeballs on you, you are making a statement, whether you are trying to make a statement in that area or not. What kind of roles and actors are playing in your commercials, who are the type of people who are modeling your products and so on. You're always making a statement. So it is important to at least be aware what you're doing, and the stereotypes that you are tapping in, whether you are supporting the empowerment of Gen Z and letting them live their truth in whichever identity they feel like, or whether you're really zoning in into the stereotypes that they're trying to depart from. How to do it is, the best way to do it is to align your brand with the causes that Gen Z supports, like the ones you saw before or this ones. And another important thing here is Gen Z is also the most scrutinizing generation. So when you are leaning into a cause, it is important that you're not just doing it on the outside as a brand, but you're actually living it through in other areas inside your company, throughout your supply chain as well, because they are the ones who are going to be paying the most attention to it. For example, there was a Gillette case. A couple of years ago, I believe, where Gillette decided to make a sharp turn. They were losing market share. Their consumer audience was aging. They were trying to gain more younger people into their consumer group, and they did the massive sharp turn into emancipation values, but they had no heritage and no history of doing it, and they actually fell into a lot of scrutiny by Gen Z. So even if you are thinking of going in that direction in a few years, it's important to start building the blocks already now, and looking closely into it. And another example is been in the news this week is the story with M&M's. Perhaps you saw where they announced that they're gonna remove the cartoons because it just caused too much scandal whether cartoons should have heels or not. And that's just another example. Whether you are whatever your position is, you are making a statement, and M&M's is using it very much to their advantage by also supporting uniting people and emancipation values. But it's something that you cannot ignore anymore.
Sure, and these trends are also steeply on the rise in emerging economies, as I said. So traditional values are fading, whether authoritarian dictators like it or not. This is happening. So here we say the father should be the head of the household. It's going down. On the right-hand side, you see it, and this is where, Gen Z is really different. And they are also in very conservative countries becoming increasingly anti-authoritarian. So just to give an example, in 2014, 66% of young people 18 to 24 in Russia agreed to this statement: father should be the head of the household. In 2022, our most recent measure, it was 50% of those young people of 18 to 24, Gen Z. So still a conservative country, definitely, but changes are happening below the surface. The same we see happening in China, Turkey, in Brazil. And so there's a huge wave coming of emancipated young people. Of course, sadly, you also see this happening in the protest against the theocratic brutal regime in Iran, on the same topics. So this is a massive change. And having a family is the most important thing in life. That's where Gen Z is also departing from earlier ideologies and visions on life, how you should live. Like getting more children, is that good for the planet? They think about it.
Yeah, so the fact that traditional values are loosening up has a massive impact, not just on women and people of other genders, but also men, because that that has, of course, a lot of pressure of having to live up to a certain standard and have certain level of responsibility. Whereas now it's a lot more about expressing yourself in whichever way um, you feel like. And we did a study recently as well where we showed that there are all kinds of forms a leadership can take, and anyone of any gender can be a great leader, no, and with all kinds of different characteristics as well. So it is quite important to help Gen Z express their autonomy and express themselves, and also connecting with them by positioning yourself with an independent mindset that matches them. You want to reflect those kind of values, and you do it by not being afraid to standing out, standing for someone, showing your own personality, because Gen Z are looking for those areas as well. This is and we will see it later on, this is the generation that pays the most attention to your brand story and brand values than any other generation before.
Thank you much. Yes, let's step into a totally different realm, which is the realm of fun and consumption. And amongst Gen Z, clearly instant gratification is on the rise, and mainly so in upcoming economies. So consumerism is a hot topic still. And as we also saw in the Western countries, that in the times of the Cultural Revolution of the 60s and the 70s, increasingly traditional taboos were going overboard. So it was okay to have fun. And this is now happening, and upcoming economies, you see, are totally catching up. In the middle graph, you see that this line is already approaching the level of hedonism in advanced economies. So this is also a massive development, and Gen Z is leading the charge here. Linked to also feeling more happy when you can spend money. Of course, in a society where you have to struggle, where you're anxious, status anxieties also play a role. And consumption can also be a form of escapism, but it can also help you prosper and develop. And obviously, if these trends are going on also in emerging economies, that is a way to environmental disaster. So this is something that we really have to keep in mind. And we think there are ways to turn traditional, maybe Western style, old style consumerism into different types of consumerism that are much more sustainable, but a lot needs to be done. And there's a lot of leadership needed.
Yeah, so on one hand, of course, it's great news for companies. Yay, they're willing to buy more and spend more. But of course, there's another facet of it where at the same time they are the most nervous of all of the consequences that consumerism brings. And there is, of course, a big debate about who should hold the responsibility. There is a growing rejection amongst Gen Z that it should be on individuals' shoulders how much plastic straws they're using, and it should be more on companies and policy level on controlling this kind of things. So it's very easy to get this wrong. And as long as you are aligned with their values, and try to produce sustainably, you're more likely to strike the chord. But again, people are complex individuals, and sometimes their values and behaviors go against each other, and consumerism and sustainability is just one of those examples.
So yes, to broaden the horizon, so what is the role of brands in all this? What we can clearly see from the data is that the interest in brand origin and brand authenticity, people liking to know the original story behind a brand or a product, that's where Gen Z, but also partly millennials, are leading the charts. So they are the highest educated generation ever in human history. So they have been taught to be critical. They have more trust in science and in education than older generations. So that's a huge opportunity. But that means that they're also indeed looking at your behavior as a brand and what you say and what you do. And is that in line with each other?
Yeah, so on one hand, this is great news. Whatever you do as a brand is going to be a lot more heard by Gen Z than it was heard by other generations in the past. It also, of course, means that they are paying a lot more attention and there's a lot more scrutiny. They're also scoring higher on the archetype of sage. So they are the ones who are driving the scandals about greenwashing and rainbow washing. So it is important to make sure that when you are very vocally supporting a cause that you're actually living it and it's not just a branding campaign. But with the brand purpose that you're including is going to be the most heard by the Generation Z, and they're going to be the most interested in who you are as the brand because they are looking for a lot more meaning behind things, not just the product that in front of them.
Definitely, and we see that this offers a lot of opportunity to connect also with the dreams, ambitions, the ideals, the worries of the young generation. It's a huge market, but you have to get it right. So another chapter, and this is the last chapter of the trends that we'll be presenting. Later on, we will dig into a specific Gen Z audience because, of course, these trends are general and massive, but you have to get it right for your brand. Looking for meaning and quality of life in various ways. Creativity and arts are increasingly important. In times of mental crisis, it is also important to see where the energy flows, where the creativity goes. And that is where this generation is taking the lead, and very steeply so, if you can see, as you can see in these data. And it's no coincidence why social platforms where also funny things are done, like TikTok or Instagram. This opens an enormous new realm of creativity and fun and enjoyment, and you see it all reflected in the trends of making fun of authorities. It's all there. And this is a huge trend that has to do also with searching for meaning, but also searching for lightness and being hopeful and making fun. Another trend that's related is that the young generation, while being under mental stress, is increasingly also realizing, even more than the older cohorts, that how you look at the world is going to influence how things evolve. How you look at your own life is going to influence how things evolve and how much opportunities you see. Because if you feel depressed, you have a narrower mindset. You see the difficulties, less opportunities, whereas if you are in a positive mood, you see much more opportunities, and also the synchronicities then happen because you see those opportunities. And that role, that more psychological effect is profound and is increasingly recognized. Another domain which goes also deeper and has to do with the world's religious traditions, wisdom traditions. And this is where emerging economies and advanced economies are very much different, is the importance of spirituality. So in general, advanced economies are more secular and upcoming economies are more traditional religiosity plays a role there in many ways. So in upcoming economies, you see that in general, people more agree to this statement. And if you look at Gen Z, they agree also more than in Western economies, but they're scoring a bit lower while there's still a rise. Well, in advanced economies, we see that the young generation throughout time becomes more and more interested in spirituality. It's not the main overruling trend, but it is rising. And when we look at the percentages, around 30% in advanced economies of young people said in 2014, spirituality is an important part of my life. Now it has risen to 40%. So things are going on below the surface in the search for meaning. They're searching for purpose. And that's why discussions around purpose, where do you stand for? Do you align also with the hopes and ideals? And the worries of these young generations are increasingly important.
Yeah, so now we've seen that Generation Z is really stricken by anxiety, guilt, search for purpose, but also quite a high level of consumerism. The products that they surround themselves is very much a way to self-express, even more so than other generations. So also the things that they surround themselves with, they are hungry for it to bring further meaning, and also to alleviate some level of guilt as well. It is important, of course, to always be authentic, because they are very attentive to these things, as we also saw from other data points. Authenticity is very important for them. They're going to be they're going to put you through a lot of scrutiny as well, but your communication should go beyond, and it has to focus on inspirational stories, movements that they can stand behind, something that gives them purpose, because they are really lacking it, and they are trying to grasp any kind of purpose draft that they can. Yeah.
So yeah, in essence, and this is also a summary, Gen Z wants to break free and follow their hearts. They want to thrive in a world that is, yeah, holding them back in thriving. And that is what you can facilitate them with. And it's a huge audience out there. So the question is how then to connect with specific Gen Z audiences. And in this part of the session, before we have the questions, we will show how this works in practice. So with the Glocalities data set, that is very rich, and you have seen the tree and what's below and above the surface, though all those elements are in the database, in the survey. We can zoom in on very specific Gen Z audiences, like using the data as a kaleidoscope, right? That you can try and make fit for your purpose, the purpose of your brand, the purpose of your cause as you're an NGO, and how to resonate with them and build bridges. So here we have the 12 chapters of our surveys, our annual surveys. We have information on segments, archetypes for storytelling, and Mash was already mentioning the sage as an important archetype, but there are more archetypes that fit Gen Z and that might fit your brand or your NGO. These archetypes you can use for linking with storytelling, for building bridges with them, and looking at your brand values. There's a lot of information on demographics, obviously, which countries do they live, which income brackets, which educational levels, do they have children or not, all these things. A lot on lifestyle, also for digital campaigns, brands. In the sustainability realm, that is quite developed at Glocalities. We have the Sustainable Development Goals that you can match with a lot of NGOs, social and environmental issues, media, persuasion, all these kind of informations are available. And the example that I want to give now to make this journey, because we step into the shoes of audiences by making journeys in the world of Glocalities application. I'm going to make this journey into Gen Z across the world, for this audience, who worries about climate change and say that they are willing to share content online. So I'm going to log into the tool now. And it needs a bit of time to load, as I can see now. Yes, there we are. So I can plan specific journeys into the tool. Now I'm going to select in the demographic field the age group of 18 to 24. But I'm going to combine this. And as you see here, we have countries, value segments, trends, archetypes. We can combine it with every of these things depending on the issue that you're working on. But now I'm selecting a sustainability field. And I'm going to select the issue of climate action. And there are lots of other issues as well, as you can see, treatment of refugees, air pollution. But I'm selecting climate change now in the application. And I'm also going to select in the fields of actions, because you can do a lot, of course. You can write a letter in support of the cause to officials, or you can vote in support of a cause. You can support online campaigns. But now we are selecting sharing related content using social media. So now we have this very specific Gen Z audience, and another audiences might be relevant for your efforts and brand. But now we selected this one. We're going to make the journey, and it's going to calculate immediately what kind of narratives, archetypes resonate with these young people, and also what kind of other social and environmental issues are relevant. What are their dreams? What do they want to realize in the coming 5 years? That's something very important to align with if you really want to help them get along. And then based on this wheel again, where we can select any variable as input, but also look at the output, we can see that in the values segmentation that we have developed, some of you may be familiar with it, we see 3 green colored value segments that this audience consists of. You have the creatives, challengers, and achievers. They are less often present amongst conservatives and socializers. And here we have the data and the percentages behind it. And we use these kind of insights in workshops. If we look at archetypes, it's very interesting to see that there are actually 3 archetypes that resonate with this specific audience that worries about climate change and wants to take action by sharing online content. The first one, the most distinguishing, is the sage. Mash already said it. It's the highest educated generation ever in human history. So they are going to really delve into these topics. They want to understand it. But also the archetype of the creator, who is a visionary and inventive. And the imagination is very important to them. And the archetype of the hero. So you may have to make a smart choice. Which of those archetypes really fits your brand, your cause, your organization, your history, your DNA? Because you should never use an archetype that is not true, that is not authentic. As Mash was saying, what Gillette tried to do, or the discussion now around the M&M campaigns. So with this tool, we can help guide creativity and rule out some options that will not work, and other options that will work, that need to be detected. So looking at what's below the surface and then making sense of it together. So these young people also worry about gender equality, quality education, and definitely also discrimination of lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people. This is a massive development globally that young people are focusing on equal rights. They want, obviously, of course, to share related content using social media, because that's how we define this audience. But they also are willing more to donate money or to volunteer. And based on these kind of data and inspiration, you can build campaigns. They more often are fan of Billie Eilish, Malala, but also Kim Kardashian. And we already saw that you had to challenge your audience of the value segment. Well, they are more likely to score on Kim Kardashian, for example, but also the creatives audience, the cultural creatives, who are more likely to value Billie Eilish. So this is in practice, and that's what I wanted to show you. There's no single Gen Z audience, just like there is no single millennial or baby boomer audience. They are all gradual developments that we chart in our data, but then you need to really dig into it and look at how things are developing. So we get to a recap. Mesh, back to you.
Yes. So as you have seen, there's really a cultural revolution happening from the Gen Z, and some of the things that really characterize them is this frustration with struggling to thrive, struggling to develop, fighting for equality and emancipation, looking for purpose, high quality of life, having a lot of anxiety, having a lot of guilt. When you are an organization that is trying to grow, whether you are a company or an NGO, it is very important to understand where Gen Z are coming from, where your younger audiences are going to be coming from, so you can empathize with them and resonate with them. That is something that Glocalities does a lot for our clients. Is we identify who is your target audience, because it really depends per case, per brand, depending on which markets you are. What is their profile, and based on that, how can you relate to them? How can you resonate with them and to communicate with them in the most efficient way? Because it is always important to have the who in mind when you are interacting with your audiences. um, and I think we can also already start answering some of the questions that I saw in the chat. So we had a question from Renee saying that it seems like there is a link between perceived uncertainties and the hedonism trend. Can you confirm? Is that a conclusion from the research? From this specific research, I will let Martijn answer that, but I also know from other research that we've seen a link between pessimism and instant gratification. If you are not sure what is going to happen in the future, or you're very pessimistic about it, it's very hard to invest in it full force, and it's much easier to focus on the right now and the joy of the now, because you just don't know what else is going to happen. And especially for Gen Z, in their experience right now, every couple of years something is happening that it feels like a new disaster. So it is hard for them to be able to think long term and plan long term, but they are feeling that tension, and they are also calling for other agents like companies and governments to secure that future.
Yes, Mash, that's totally the case. And I think this also takes leadership. Because if you just cater to the need of more consumption and more thrills, more action, yeah, what will that lead to? Will that make people more happy? Not necessarily. On the contrary. So, and at the same time, Gen Z is longing to thrive, and they want to learn also from older generations who have to take their role and have to play their role and play their part. So I think responsible leadership from brands, from NGOs, from governments and all that also opens major opportunities. So it's a very interesting discussion, because on the one hand we have this rising consumerism, and we live in a consumerist, of course, capitalistic system that is exploitative. And that will lead to a breakdown of the climate and the environment. At the same time, Gen Z is the highest educated generation ever in human history, and they have the keys to solving these environmental problems, because the older generation do not have enough creativity and drive and vitality to do this. So the question is, are we going to facilitate them or not? And that's a personal choice. But that's what we see here in the data. It's also a huge opportunity. So let's go to some other questions. Mash, did you detect some?
Yes, let's see. First of all, the question was, are the differences statistically significant? Yes, we're showing the difference that are statistically significant that we found in the data. So Laura asked, are Gen Z going to be higher consumers, but the products need to be aligned with their values, not only how they look? Yes, exactly. So there is exactly that tension that we explained, that they are both scoring high on consumerism and they are scoring very high on consumers' guilt. So the way to strike the chord is to align with their values and try to bring purpose as much as possible, to have secular, for example, recyclable or recycled or reusable products and so on. It's another thing that is very important to mention here, and Martijn started the session with. Right now, we're talking broadly about the entirety of Gen Z, but of course, they very much differ within that generation, not just within cultures, but within those value segments, like Martijn mentioned. So there's also there's a lot more nuance when you start looking within the generation on who is more driven by consumerism, who is more driven by climate anxieties, and which parts. And of course, they do overlap with people also saying, I don't like that it's my responsibility because the impact that I personally make is not compared to the impact that multinationals make and so on. So there's another tension there. What is the percentage of Gen Z as part of total population in each of the countries that are part of the research? So we are having national representative surveys, which means for each country, Gen Z are as big of a share as it is according to the census data for that country.
And here is also a question, what is Gen Z's general attitude towards education, lifelong learning, and traditional work? Well, education is one of the Sustainable Development Goals that they see as most important for securing a better future for people all around the world. So they are the highest educated generation in human history, and they prioritize education for a lot. But we also know that the educational system is not always facilitating them because they are increasingly anti-authoritarian and networked and creative and like to have fun. And not everywhere, to put it mildly, the educational system has developed in that way. Because, and that is one of the main challenges, I think, for education. But also, to take it more broadly, as 50% of the world population is under 30, if we look at parliamentarians, only 2.6% of parliamentarians are under 30. So this is where the huge disconnect is between the system, the world as we are used to living in, and what is actually happening, and where young people are also disillusioned, feel let down by society. Because if they are not represented by parliamentarians or by, well, political leaders, business leaders, NGO leaders, it is so important to have them on board to restore trust. So, yeah, and their orientation towards lifelong learning is more positive than compared to lifelong learning amongst the older generation, who are more used to like the three-stage life. So you study, you work, and then you retire. The young generation is much more fluid in that and also has the answers, but we have to facilitate them.
I think this nicely leads into the other comment here by Peter. He says, this gap is so sad. Does the gap between Gen Z and other generations mean we'll all have to become more Gen Z to reconnect with them in an authentic way? We can only reconnect from the heart and stand next to them in the pursuit of a livable future for all. Well, I would say that the answer is twofold. I think it is important when you're making decisions, especially when you're trying to attract younger audiences, to have Gen Z voices at the table when it comes to both policy and branding and decision making. Having said that, there are, of course, tools that help you empathize with them. And that's something that Glocalities, for example, does, is we really help to step into the shoes of your audience. And if it is then Gen Z, then we really have this empathetic exercises of trying to understand where they're coming from, where their values are established, and how to align with them and communicate with them in the way that resonates with them. But of course, again, I do want to stress that it is very valuable to have the groups that you are trying to attract present, also represented at the table of decision making.
Sure, there's another question. What are the major characteristic differences with millennials according to the studies across the waves? They both seem clearly like purpose-driven generations as well as digital natives. Yes, as you can see from many of the charts, it's all gradual. So in, for example, general flexibility, Gen Z is leading the chart. Then you have the millennials. So it's not black and white in the sense that you're either part of this generation or that. It's all these value trends. This is also how we interpret the data. It's not binary, it's gradual. So, but indeed, they are purpose-driven generations more than older generations. Gen Z are clearly even more digital natives than millennials. An additional question, would you consider Gen Z more individualistic than millennials? Well, that depends on how you would define individualism. If it's about being free to express your inner values and who you are in, for example, in the field of general flexibility, yes, they are less non-traditional in that sense. But still, they are also longing for a lot to belong in society. So it's paradoxical. And that's why we look beneath the surface, and we also look at specific audiences within Gen Z, because you have also ultra-conservative segments within Gen Z. It goes too far to cover that now in this short webinar. So these trends are gradual, it's nuanced, but then again also massive, because this rise in anti-authoritarian attitudes is taking effect in a lot of economies. This rise of general flexibility, the focus on gender equality, is going to affect the world throughout. Mash, do you want to hop onto another question?
Oh, another question. I just want to add to
add?
that one. Yes. I think what we sometimes see is the link between being individualistic, in again in how will you define that, but valuing the individualistic values, and also having the mind space to support very abstract causes that are not necessarily directly affecting you or the person right next to you. So they are more likely to support causes of abstract values of groups of people that they're not necessarily directly interacting with. Whereas when you're more community centered, then you are often more focused on what is happening in your immediate surrounding, in your immediate family, and focusing on the safety of the people that are very tangible to you. None of those perspective is the wrong one, but it is a different angle of the mindset. Let's see if we have other questions. What are the differences? Again, similar. What are the difference between millennials? I would say something that we mentioned is the way, at least I see it, is Gen Z are a lot more anxiety driven. They have a lot more hopelessness, and they are also have a lot less patience. So they are immediately starting a battle or a fight, and they feel like the people are running out of time, and perhaps they're right. But millennials are a lot more subdued and calm and still very much focused on their careers and long term and so on.
There are two more questions. Mash, can you read them? Would you like me to read?
Is there a difference between Gen Z and other cohorts bigger? For example,
Yeah, we
60s
didn't
and
do the
70s.
research in the 60s and the 70s, of course, but we see that the divides between generations on some of the topics mentioned are increasing. And oftentimes it was thought in the past that, well, they will grow towards each other. But now I think there is a rift on many aspects. We see that Gen Z is really different. And as Mash was saying, they are growing up in a time with less perspective. And I think if you make the comparisons between the advanced economies and the developing economies, we see some of the trends that happened already in the 60s and 70s here in the advanced economies are now taking place in these emerging economies, but in a totally different environment. Because now the possibilities for digital surveillance, like face recognitions, and are also way more developed. So the possibilities for autocratic repression, sadly, are much more developed. So I think, it's hard to compare these time frames. At the same time, we have the digital revolution, and young people are much more connected, and they can go beyond firewalls and using VPNs. And they also like to make fun of older generations who are very conservative and making internet memes about them. And so, and we cannot, with our data, compare the 60s and the 70s of the last century. But looking at the data also from the World Value Survey, I think there are quite some similarities now. And a major difference is that 9 out of 10 young people live in emerging economies. So it was like a niche development because only like 10% of the world's youth live in the advanced world. And that was also the case approximately, of course, decades ago. But now, with the digital technologies, lots more young people are being empowered. And I think that's a positive development. Let's get back to Mash.
Yeah, so we have another question. Do you have any data or prospects on Generation Alpha? So Generation Alpha are people that are even younger than Gen Z. We started surveys from people that are aged 18 and upwards, so that we have their consent and so on. So we don't have data for people who are under 18. So for that, you'll have to wait for a few years before we can do a webinar on those.
Yeah. I would like to say, as we're closing the session and some people are already leaving, thank you very much for your attention. I would like to remark that next week we will have another webinar together with the Resource Alliance and Global Citizen. And Global Citizen is a party that we released a survey with. And it is focused on changing the narrative about the future. In the field of sustainability, it's a huge network of 30,000 people who are working for social justice, for environmental justice. At my LinkedIn account, you find the link to that specific webinar that you're all invited to join. There will be lots of cases also from the Global South. So this is one of our clients and partners who want to apply these learnings. So this was a briefing on the trends, but we also do a lot of work on the ground and facilitate organizations. And of course, we're also available to serve you if you're interested in having such a presentation at your office during a lunch break, or having a discussion about what we have in the data for your brand, your cause, your audience, your related to your brand values or market entries, we are happy to have these conversations with you. Let's go to Melis.
Yes. Thank you everyone for joining again. And before we close, I would like to remind you to follow us on LinkedIn and Twitter because we're going to have more webinars this year. So if you want to know more about the upcoming webinars, you can learn by following us. And thank you so much for joining. And if you would like to have a one-to-one session or meeting with Mash or Martijn, just drop me an email. I'll arrange it for you.
Have a great day. Thank you all.
Have a great day. Thank you.
Bye bye. Thank you for joining.